I would not be very bullish on the public as a whole being able to effectively allocate funding towards the highest impact projects. But what I would be very bullish on is the public and patients having a very clear idea of what the most underserved needs are and where funding at a high level, macroscopically, should be allocated. You go a level deeper than that, you need people that have deep domain experience in the sciences to be able to really due diligence a project, and you need people with deep entrepreneurial experience and translational experience.
Hey, Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the DeSci Podcast. Tyler Golato is the co-founder and CSO at Molecule and is a co-initiator at DeSci. He has a background in academia, having studied biochemistry and molecular biology, and worked as a research scientist in radiation oncology and molecular gerontology. He went on to help found Molecule and has become a pioneer of DeSci with interesting insights into what the space might come to look like. Today we spoke about the origins of Molecule, common criticisms, and Tyler's vision for the future of bio-DAOs. Hope you enjoy. All right, so first things first, man, you have a pretty distinct path I think would be wrong not to touch on. So you have your roots in biochemistry and molecular biology, and you went on to do research in oncology and aging. You moved into doing longevity biotech and eventually found yourself at DeSci and Molecule. Why don't we start by painting a bit of a picture there? What were some of those earlier interests for you, and how did they lead you to sitting down here with me today?
Yeah, so I started out my career wanting to be a physician. My sister, when she was born, I was 5 years old. She spent a lot of time in the hospital. She had a respiratory condition at an early age. I guess physicians as fundamentally saving my sister's life, and that drove me towards, even from a very young age, wanting to be a doctor. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. I think this was a bit atypical in my family. We didn't have any academics. But I really fell in love with the idea of learning medicine. I fell in love with biology. And so in my early from kind of end of grade school into high school, I was really passionate about this idea. And I was spending a ton of my time in hospitals. I was working as a nurse aide relatively early in my life, doing a ton of volunteering. And through that kind of gained what was my first real exposure to the US healthcare system. And sort of through that and through this kind of maturation process, also realized, okay, if I want to study medicine, I should probably, kind of take the traditional pre-med track. I was a biochemistry student at university and also started getting, I think, kind of more seriously involved in the clinic. I developed a strong interest in clinical oncology. I have quite a bit of cancer in my family, and also just was always really interested in cancer as a phenotype. So this idea of the kind of almost the immortal phenotype, or, having this sort of level of cellular dysfunction that I think from a scientific perspective, or if you're studying it, is extremely interesting. And it was really at this point when I began kind of meaningfully engaging how oncology looked like in practice, that I start to realize how applied and how primitive medicine was at a fundamental level. So I think anyone who kind of goes the route of wanting to be an oncologist comes up against this point when they start looking at the standard of care. They start looking at, what are sort of prognoses and outcomes. And you kind of realize relatively quickly that, even given the context of the war on cancer and the amount of money that we've spent, it's probably more money than researching any other disease phenotype since the 1970s. If you extrapolate this across all cancers, we've increased overall survival by about 5%. So you kind of realize relatively quickly that medicine is very applied, it's very primitive. And so I had this realization, kind of seeing, I was interested in intractable cancers, things like pancreatic adenocarcinoma, for example, glioblastoma multiforme, so brain cancer. This realization that if I wanted to have some sort of tangible impact in that field, I was actually probably much better off doing research than I was being a physician. So this idea that, cool, I would love to figure out a way to push the field forward rather than just applying a standard of care. And the other learning there was that being an oncologist is, I think you're spending a lot more time being a psychologist, a psychiatrist, someone working in hospice, learning how to be with people, learning how to facilitate the dying process, which was also really resonated, but wanted to figure out how to do better. So I kind of start to go down this MD PhD pathway, wanted to front load that with research. I was still had like a super high degree of uncertainty about what I actually wanted to do. And during this time, I was at Columbia University in experimental therapeutics laboratory, working in this kind of translational drug development paradigm. So I was working with a guy called Robert Fine, who was relatively senior in the hematology oncology department at Columbia, and he was basically doing relatively rapid prototyping of novel drug combinations, trying to overcome mechanisms of chemotherapy resistance. And what I learned a bunch of things from him that were super illuminating for me about research and how it's applied. So he was basically working in Washington Heights, where Columbia's medical center is in New York. And we would have patients that would basically come and try to participate in these experimental clinical trials that we were running that were typically like, second or third line therapeutics. So these are people who are like, they've kind of been through the ringer with cancer. They don't have many other options. And there would be patients that would come to the clinic, and if they didn't meet the inclusion criteria and they didn't have health insurance, the hospital, the university doesn't have to treat them. Cancer is not a super acute condition. It's not an acute emergency. They could just be basically turfed away from the hospital. And this had a really, really profound impact on me. So just seeing in like one of the wealthiest countries in the world, at one of the wealthiest medical centers in one of the wealthiest cities, there's like people who are dying of cancer that are like really falling through the cracks of the system. And the system can't necessarily accommodate all of these folks. And so during a strong period of reflection there, this was like my first kind of like, I had seen the cracks in the armor in the context of like how healthcare functions, but this was like very much now like putting a face to it. And then looking at the PI that I was working with, he was really interested in trying to figure out, okay, rather than doing like, he was doing cutting edge science, but more importantly, he was basically trying to figure out like, what is the kind of lowest cost way to bring like effective therapies to patients, using off patent drugs, for example, in novel combinations, basically trying to figure out a meaningful way to actually have an impact where it wouldn't be bottlenecked by the ability for someone to pay for it the way that like, maybe a new tyrosine kinase inhibitor at the time, or an immune therapy or something like this might be. And so I had this kind of moment then where I realized, okay, you have someone who's been working in this field for 40 years. He's very senior. His day-to-day practice, both as a physician and as a researcher, is literally being bottlenecked in many cases by his inability to treat patients due to their inability to pay for it. And this goes beyond just medicine now. This is also, fundamentally at the research level. So through this kind of lived in my memory. I also became kind of disenchanted with oncology as a practice. I was really interested in preventative medicine, which was just not within the kind of repertoire of teachings. I felt like Western medicine as a practice is kind of reactive. And around this time, longevity medicine, biogerontology was also becoming, I think, kind of just breaking out of its infancy and becoming a much more respected research field. And so I left Columbia and joined the National Institute on Aging at NIH in Baltimore, and joined a laboratory with Wilhelm Bohr and David Wilson working on DNA damage and repair, particularly with a focus on oxidative stress and base excision repair. I was basically developing novel assays to measure base excision repair capacity in vivo with this kind of thesis that you would see a decline in BER capacity with age. This was an amazing experience. The NIH is working in intramural laboratory at the NIH is a great position. It's not really a publish or perish type environment. You have a budget that lasts, it's reviewed every 4 years, and you're given quite a lot of autonomy, a completely different relationship with funding than most academics do. While I was there, I kind of realized that I'd spent the better part of my career focused on diseases of affluence. So things like cancer, things like aging. I was curious to what extent I had maybe been missing out on things by always looking at these things that really were just related to aging and stuff. And so I did this kind of sub-fellowship in health disparities. And through that, ended up moving to completely detouring, moved to South Africa to work in HIV vaccine development, and also learn about how clinical trials are run in a completely different context. And yeah, at one point, the trial didn't work. It was basically, it was a trial that was looking at building on recent failures of a a HIV vaccine that had been developed in Thailand using a number of protein adjuvants with relatively low efficacy and trying to improve that, and ultimately ended up not working. And I knew that, I didn't really want to be a physician in the traditional sense. What I was really interested in was like, is there some way to have even a kind of small impact on the macroeconomics and the mechanism design, the incentive design of this system, whether it's funding science, whether it's translating medicines. I mean, it's really this entire end-to-end process that I felt was fundamentally broken, and kind of had this realization that if you had even a 1 or 2% improvement in the kind of efficiency of that process at any given point, it would have a profound effect on having impact, saving lives, saving cost. And yeah, kind of at that time, this is kind of now getting into the origin of Molecule, but I also produce electronic music, and in Cape Town at the time was like, I had a few friends that were in that scene, and there was a guy called Kent Bree. I was shouting to him about my frustrations and my job, and kind of this is in the HIV thing at the time, and how when I came to South Africa initially, I wanted to do like cancer research, but there's like 140 oncologists in the entire country. No one's doing anything really cutting edge. And he was like, "Hey man, you know what? The CTO of my company, he worked at this company called Linum Labs, is really into thinking about pharma and kind of new ways to engineer incentives there." This is Paul Kohlhaas that he was talking about, our CEO and my co-founder. He's like, "You should really chat to him." And I had a call with Paul. I had been, curiously watching crypto from 2013, had like interacted with it a bunch of times, but by no means like over-indexed, or like I wasn't a maxi. I wasn't thinking this technology is the future in any kind of meaningful way. And Paul, over 2 months, basically showed me what were these very bare bone kind of janky diagrams for what at the time was a system to use NFTs, for which the only use case at that moment was like CryptoKitties. Like this was already completely crazy as an idea, but basically using NFTs to hold intellectual property around patents, and at the time using a token bonding curve mechanism to fundraise for them. And he convinced me over a couple of months that there was something there. I had quite a different vision for what we could possibly do together, but we decided to, after getting to know each other a bit better, like go on this journey of building, I think what today is slowly becoming, a really core pillar of the DeSci movement.
Amazing. I definitely want to jump in and touch on some of the sort of larger predictions and hopes that you have for DeSci in particular, but now that we've touched on a bit of your earlier interest in the story behind how Molecule and this ecosystem really came together, first I want to hear about some of these more common criticisms in DeSci more generally, starting with this process of research fundamentally. So maybe you could explain to me, and a lot of people listening who also don't have formal backgrounds in scientific research, what's the argument that research can actually be carried out in a decentralized manner, and why might that matter?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here. I'm going to try and speak fundamentally from the drug development context. Research happens in a lot of different disciplines, whether it's in the social sciences or even other aspects of the sort of hard sciences in general. But speaking from the life sciences context, one of the things, particularly with drug development, one of the things that has fundamentally changed over the past 20 to 30 years is that a long time ago, let's say in the 90s and the 80s, you had a very vertically integrated pharmaceutical development system where pharmaceutical companies would do in-house R&D and then everything downstream from drug discovery to market. And over the years, the kind of internal rate of return on R&D has slowly been approaching zero. And there was this kind of collective realization that it probably made more sense to leverage all of the individual PI in the world who made it their life's work to basically investigate a disease phenotype or a disease area. And pharma sort of caught on to the fact that rather than doing all of this in-house R&D, it's probably cheaper to just buy innovation or outsource innovation from academia, right? And so along this timeline, what has kind of happened, and Andrew Lowe wrote a paper about this recently, looking at MIT's tech transfer over the years, and also kind of reflecting on how this thing that I'm talking about has changed. Today, like, I don't know the exact number, but it's more than 50% of the drug approvals and the drugs coming to market today, of the best-selling drugs, are originating from academia. And so what you already have happening in this context is drug development is becoming increasingly distributed, increasingly decentralized. But there's still a few central players that are controlling the process. So in this new reality, what happens is pharmaceutical companies go around, they form relationships with universities. They find PIs that are doing cutting edge work in drug discovery and drug design, et cetera. They buy that innovation from the academic institution, and then they leverage partners, developers, contract research organizations, for example, to make contributions to the development of that particular piece of research or that asset. But if you think about it, this myth of the funnel that you see, this end-to-end funnel is, that being a vertically integrated thing is no longer real. There was a Science Translational Medicine paper about this, a number of years ago, the idea that the drug development pipeline is a lie. And they talked about this process of like modularity and this idea that there's all of these different stakeholders that are adding value at different parts of the value chain. What's interesting is that a lot of these things in this kind of age of the internet, in this very globalized world, still rely on very concrete, let's say, sort of whether it's your geographic location. So for example, within Boston, within San Francisco, within Oxford, Cambridge, there's these very tight relationships. There's pharmaceutical companies that are working with universities and innovation arms. The sort of thesis that we have is that system that is already forming is kind of extensible globally, even to areas that are largely underserved by having like pharmaceutical companies or service providers in those jurisdictions. And as a part of that, there's kind of this massive treasure trove of innovation and intellectual property that is kind of locked up in universities all over the world. And then if there was a proper system to leverage ownership and intellectual property as a core incentive and a way to distribute it very easily, that you would be able to really scale the level of modularity within that system. So kind of imagining now you have an academic laboratory, a contract research organization, a manufacturer, a distributor, a healthcare provider, all basically providing a service in the context of this kind of collaborative drug development ecosystem. And in exchange for that, what people are actually getting is ownership in the asset and really a piece of this. And beyond that, we also see patients themselves as having a core role in that process, right? Patient advocacy groups have largely been financing innovation in their disease areas, for example, but not really able to meaningfully capture upside or be sustainable, always reliant on philanthropic donations, kind of in perpetuity. They should actually be at the core of enabling that innovation as well. So now I could talk about this more, like how this is broadly extensible to all of DeSci and many other areas of research. But I think what's really interesting about drug development specifically is that it is fundamentally built around this value capture mechanism around intellectual property that has largely been monopolized by central players. And this is one of the reasons why, I have a very long-term DeSci thesis. But I really believe that, the kind of first area that we can disrupt is one where there's this kind of clear value capture mechanism that maybe is not as apparent in other areas.
Definitely. To move for a second to the other side of the equation here, another pretty common criticism lies on, and you've I think touched on this very briefly, but on the funding side of things, right? Especially around this question of decentralization and more specifically, like the relative level of domain expertise needed to actually allocate funds for high quality research. Is there a way that you think about this problem?
Yeah, I think about it from many different perspectives and many different contexts. I think you have this sort of dilemma at the moment in the context of like the kind of funding paradigms that we're looking at, where you have a lot of disparate skills that are needed at different parts of the pipeline, meaning the skills that you need to do scientific due diligence are very different from the skills that you need to understand an IP pathway, or very different than the skills that you need to understand effective translation, entrepreneurialism, what it means to fundraise. And so what I've really spent a lot of time thinking about is, in the context of, I would not be very bullish on the public as a whole being able to effectively allocate funding towards the highest impact projects. But what I would be very bullish on is the public and patients having a very clear idea of what the most underserved needs are and where funding at a high level macroscopically should be allocated. You go a level deeper than that, you need people that have deep domain experience in the sciences to be able to really due diligence a project, and you need people with deep entrepreneurial experience and translational experience. So the way that I've been thinking about DAOs in this context in decentralized science is, mechanism and incentive design that enables you to bring all of these players together in a common structure with the goal of leveraging their individual skills when that sort of layer of coordination is needed. So the kind of superficial lens to look at a DAO, a bio-DAO through, for example, would be to say, why would I think that the public or any, Joe Schmo and their mother would be able to do better DD and be a better funding allocator than a professional VC or a grant funding body that has been doing this for decades? And my argument is, you're absolutely right, they wouldn't. But what's interesting is, the grant funding body often lacks the entrepreneurial expertise. The entrepreneur, in many cases, the VC might not have the deepest scientific diligence. They both might be fundamentally lacking patient perspectives. And through, I think, really efficient system design, which is a really hard thing. This is another challenging thing in itself, and I'm not arguing that we've managed to crack it yet. But I think with the right engineered system, I think you could 100%, have 100% certainty that you could devise a better system than exists right now, given that everyone is kind of looking through the problem through the lens of their own bias, often with one relatively singular perspective on a problem.
Got it. So before we, dig into, your vision for BioDAOs of the future pretty soon, I'd be interested on that broader topic of decentralization as kind of a preface to that. What within this problem, macroscopically here, of tackling scientific research and funding, do you think most requires decentralization? And then on the other side of that, what do you think most demands some level of centralization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a couple of things that I've firsthand experienced where decentralization play a really strong role, and maybe kind of framing this within, at the actual where the funding is coming from, I think has a huge impact. So because everyone has a slightly different modus operandi, and so the source of funding and to an extent it already is, right? Like if you look at tax dollars, everyone pays taxes, and that funding is kind of progressively allocated in a way that has been developed over the years based on a number of metrics that I won't necessarily get into. But interestingly, there's a massive discrepancy between the money that the public is allocating via taxes and the actual decisions over how that money is being spent. And so there's like kind of macroscopic things in there that I think could do with a little bit more decentralization in the context of the public having input. And so this would be like at a very high level. And Alexei Guzzi raised this in a blog article that he wrote, but less than 2% of funding, NIH funding, is allocated to investigators that are under the age of 35, which is completely crazy. Like if you think about the number of multi-billionaire entrepreneurs that have built insane companies before their 30s, or if you look at the career of many great scientists, many great Renaissance painters, whatever, prime years are 100%, people are doing great work in their early 20s. So this is crazy. I think, so the funding process itself, I think due diligence, scientific evaluation, peer review, all of these things where you require crowd intelligence. And when I say crowd intelligence, I don't mean everyone, but the right crowd, the right scientific expertise. I think the process of actually incubating science and translating it can benefit from decentralization, meaning having many different providers, many different contract research organizations that have, there's been studies published that have shown that if a centralized group of players is producing results, actually even just doing science, that the replicability of the results is often lower than, having different organizations do things. And this makes sense, right? Everyone has their own bias. People make mistakes in the same way. So the process of actually doing science would benefit from decentralization. But, there's things that in my mind don't benefit from as much decentralization. And these are kind of more operational things. So if I was thinking about a DAO, for example, you need I think the selection process on who you bring in. So the idea of picking people bottom up from the community can be decentralized. But at the end of the day, there does absolutely need to be highly accountable people that have responsibility, that are doing certain roles like full-time equivalent people. And you can't necessarily outsource that function to, a bunch of operators working 2 hours a week for problems with continuity and other things. The process of research management is something that I think can also be, this is where I kind of hold contrasting opinions, and I don't have a high degree of certainty myself. Like, I think having a really, really strong vision and kind of an almost militaristic level of belief in a certain approach, similar to, like, if you look at like the Rockefeller Institute or many of the great institutes that have actually been really successful with funding and translating science. This is a massive strength. At the same time, I think it also can bring about a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of dogma that is extremely dangerous. So yeah, I'm still learning by kind of seeing these things in practice and seeing where decentralization works and what it doesn't. But if I wanted to simplify it, I would say deal sourcing, evaluation, due diligence, peer review, early stage incubation, allocating funds. These kind of functions can be decentralized. Operations, the kind of core entrepreneurial activities, when this becomes a startup and it needs to be built, I think you're going to need a founder still. You need aligned incentives. So there's, definitely a lot of strong learnings to take away from kind of centralized structures.
Totally. I think it's about time, wanted to take some time to dig into your vision for the future of Molecule, Bio-DAOs, and the space more broadly. You put out this Twitter thread a week or so ago touching on a number of key areas. And I think there's a great opportunity to really just dig in on some of these a little bit more. And the first that you mentioned that I think is sort of a good place to start here is this idea of UX, right? Like, some of the best performing crypto products we've seen this year have been integrations with larger Web2 platforms like Instagram or Reddit, but like totally scrubbed of any mention of terms like NFTs or crypto. And I think there might be a comparison to draw to academia here, especially considering it's such an entrenched and change-averse space. So with that in mind, what do you think are the necessary conditions on that UX front for real changes in scientific funding and research to happen?
Yeah, I've always been of the conviction that, at a super high level, the way that DeSci wins adoption is by quite literally just being an easier thing to use in the current system. Having an onboarding flow, arriving in this ecosystem, and having the ability to kind of wayfind and quickly get to where you need. And to maybe like take one step back, I had a realization the other day that if I was putting on my non-Web3 native scientist hat and walking into this ecosystem, I would feel completely lost, completely underwater, not understand what's going on. If you go to the landing pages for many of the projects, including my own, I would make this statement about Molecule. I would make this statement, about some of the DAOs that I'm working on. They're always trying to improve this, obviously, but it is much of the content, much of the outward-facing collateral is written from the perspective of somebody that is so deep in the ecosystem, because it is, right? That is the people who are kind of like writing these statements. And so what I would love to see, and kind of look out for the V2 of the next iteration of Molecule as a landing page in the ecosystem, like showing up and having some level of conditional logic. Like, are you a researcher? Are you a patient? Are you a builder? Are you a funder? Do you want to do X, Y, or Z? And just have very seamless kind of like, I show up here and I get to where I want to be relatively quickly. I think there's this challenge of this kind of multi-stakeholder problem. The kind of user groups that I just mentioned, all having, your Web3 native tech person, your, let's say emeritus professor, your grad student, your patient, your entrepreneur, they all have a different pattern language in the context of like what they recognize and view as trustworthy immediately. Building trust is a huge thing. Having a sense that, like, if I interact with this ecosystem, is this something that's going to add value to my work? Is it something that is going to enable me to get funding? I went through the process of working with a UI to UX researcher the other day, kind of going on this journey through Molecule's collateral, and realized relatively quickly that a ton of open question marks and kind of anti-signals that if I was using this and trying to interact with it, I wouldn't necessarily get the information that I need quickly enough to make a decision if this was going to be helpful or hurtful. So this kind of process, and maybe one thing within that, a lot of it has to do with this kind of Web3 jargon and the kind of technical hurdles to onboarding that leave a lot of questions fundamentally unanswered. Like, okay, if I have to create a wallet to interact with this website, and then I have to acquire a token, like, do I have tax implications? Is this legal? Like, does it make sense? Like, but if I upload my project here, am I like, what's the nature of, like, do I need to give away my intellectual property? Can someone scoop me? What level of information do I need to provide to be able to interact with this? And these sort of questions, like, it just comes from, I think, a certain, we're all building really passionately in this space with a lot of assumptions. And I think there's a lot of people who were scientists and who are scientists, but like have made a transition. And so, we're kind of the frustrated user that we're building for. But we also have enough context that is somewhat unusual for this space, meaning that like many of us have been in it for quite a while. We've already drunk the Kool-Aid. And so my personal belief is that if we can create a system where a researcher shows up, they upload information about their project and they fill it out. It's easier to fill out than a grant application. Within a moment, they're being showed where there's available pools of funding from different communities that are allocating, ready to allocate capital toward them, with a very clear list of benefits, pros, cons, the ability to quickly schedule an interview, testimonials that show other people who they recognize that have been through the process, that kind of show that it's safe. There's all of these things that I think we can do to kind of dramatically improve our ability to attract users, retain them, and have people interact with the system. But it just requires a much more rigorous focus on, in my opinion, non-native Web3 folks and the kind of progressive abstraction of technology into the back end. Like there's always these periods in tech, like, the dot-com boom, cloud computing, crypto, all of these. There's a moment where I think it makes sense because of the buzz to be strongly associated with a back end enabling something from a front end perspective. But the maturation of the technology is always the kind of dissolution of that into the back end in a way where the user doesn't even know it's interacting with it. And I think that's what maturation actually looks like.
Gotcha. I think another key area here that you've mentioned are more broadly the economics of research. Traditionally we've relied primarily on the endowment model to bring, good research to fruition. And maybe you can touch on what that means specifically, but do you think any larger changes need to be made here?
With funding in general, or in terms of DAO specifically?
Both. I would say both. I'd say on the front of DAOs, but more generally in academia, if there's any opportunity or necessity to sort of work our way back and change how funding is done specifically.
It's an interesting question. I mean, there's my kind of main feeling at the moment, and this is one that I think is informed more by having a sense of how the scientific method functions, is that there's just really not enough experimentation happening, period. So at a really high level, we're really dogmatic about the way that we do funding. There's a way that grant committees make decisions. There's a way that if you look at grant funding, if you look at VC, if you look at all these things, I mean, one of the biggest innovations in crypto is this idea of the venture DAO, just the idea that I don't necessarily know if this is a better way to allocate funding, but what's interesting to me is that there are now people doing experiments with entirely new approaches. And I always liked this idea of I can't tell you how many research papers I've read and even textbooks looking at the R&D process, where at some point there's these interviews with experts looking at the kind of decline of innovation. And there's always this kind of very ambiguous, yes, there should be more experimentation or we should try other things. There's not that many people actually doing it. One great example of this, for example, recently was fast grants, impetus grants, for example. There are people these are not even crypto related initiatives, although they're funded by crypto people. This idea that let's just try creating a fund that is willing to make a decision on funding in 2 weeks and send someone a check. Let's figure out ways to kind of what Sam Altman's doing at a certain level as well, and Peter Thiel to, I'm not always I won't make a comment about Peter Thiel, but I think this notion of just giving smart people money and seeing what happens. There's all of these things where I think there could be a huge amount of innovation. What if we figured out a way to enable the public to just directly fund a specific laboratory and own a stake in it, for example? What if you could treat laboratories more like biotech companies? I mean, there's so many models we could play around with, trying to figure out sustainable ways to fund research, more research mechanisms in perpetuity, things like an IP commons. There's a lot of theoretical, interesting ideas, but what I love about Web3 and is the idea that it's now you go into the practical, the applied. It's okay, let's actually do this. Let's create a token economic structure that incentivizes this sort of system or that sort of system and create, the necessary sandboxes to actually run these experiments. I have my own biases and beliefs around what I think would be a much more efficient funding system. But the thing that I would actually love to see in practice it's people trying all of these experiments in parallel, and in 2 or 3 years being able to say, wow, look at this, like we figured out a way to do this that is just much better than the status quo.
Got it. I'd be curious to shift to like a user level now. I'd be interested in hearing how you think about incentives specifically in DeSci. Some projects, and you've spoken about this briefly, some projects might opt for sort of a shorter term bootstrapping of a network, while others might shoot for longer term growth. And, there's a real trade-off between those approaches, right? But I'd be curious longer term here, how you tend to think about both of those.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, and, Vincent Weiser is a person who's like heavily influenced my thinking here in general when it comes to tokenomics, is that, it would probably be difficult for you to show me like more than three long-term successful token economic models in crypto, meaning that I think, Ethereum, yes, but most people get it wrong. Most thinking is derivative. There's not a huge amount of originality in the space. And my firm belief is like the good models have kind of yet to be created. And we should be doing much, much, much more wild experimentation than we're doing at the moment. And when I think about incentives, the reason that I'm compelled to work in this space is because it is a incentive and mechanism design space. And I think the problems in healthcare are an incentive and mechanism design problem. I think if you figured out ways to bring the cost of drug development kind of asymptotically approaching zero, which I think technology will do over time, I think that with the current market structure that we have around it, it would likely be profit margins increasing, not necessarily cost saving transferred on to the consumer or the patient. And why is that? It's largely because of market structures. It's largely because of the incentive structures of having, these kind of publicly traded shareholder driven organizations that are operating in the context of drug development. That my thesis was always that by changing the incentives, so this is actually not a technological innovation. I would imagine there's ways to do this in a Web 2 world, but it would be, I think, a lot more frictionful, is that, like, interestingly, value capture operates, like, the people that are creating the most value in healthcare, economic and user feedback otherwise, it's two groups. It's researchers and patients, right? Researchers normally kind of, I think, motivated through largely altruistic causes that are then taken advantage of by a kind of non-altruistic, late-stage hypercapitalistic society. And so if you figured out a way to empower the researcher and the patient, meaning that they actually had an ownership stake, they were the folks that had, and this is the incentive now, ownership as an incentive for behavior. How would a diabetic price insulin? How would a cancer patient price a cancer medication? Even if they had money to make, people who were, you don't really care about money when your health is in the toilet. This is the reality. And so this is an example of how you can leverage incentives relatively simply to make a kind of stepwise change in how, individuals, stakeholders behave. And this is where crypto is really powerful. You can design these systems with Web3. There's other areas when I think about incentives, so maybe at a very high level, I've always been attracted to this notion of changing the intellectual property system, because intellectual property is fundamentally an incentive. It's an incentive for someone to take a risk, to spend money, to develop something so they're able to enforce market exclusivity. If you take a step back from that, it doesn't really have many other purposes. And so the areas where I'm less convinced at the moment that, the challenge is almost harder, even though the areas might not seem as high impact, is like when you get into the cultural currency of science and incentives there, like things like prestige, which is going to be very hard for DeSci in general. As somebody who's probably the most bullish person on DeSci, or I surely am among the top 10 in terms of like people who believe in this space more than anyone at the moment. I think given the option to publish a paper in Nature or some sort of like decentralized journal, I would probably publish in Nature because I'm a human being, because I still have some sort of, ego, because I want my work to be high impact and stuff like this. And this is a hard thing to break. And it's a hard thing to break because token incentives normally deal with economics. And these are not economic problems, in my opinion. These are problems of like, why is Nature prestigious? It's because of the history. It's because of the number of, Nobels that have been associated with it. I think once these journals have that level of credibility of like having a history of, being cited extremely often, having the best scientists in the world publish in them, it'll be possible to see that stepwise change. But I think and to be fair, I don't want to say that I'm not extremely bullish on people who are trying to crack the publishing problem or the reproducibility problem or the, kind of all of the problems that exist in science and DeSci. But I genuinely believe that it's a harder problem to solve because you're basically trying to change the culture, the underlying culture of how science works. And I believe that while you can do this, mission, vision, values will resonate. There will be people who adopt. But what you're really fighting at the end of the day is human ego, which is, I think, people underestimate the power of that force.
Got it. To sort of continue that train of thought on a user level as well here, and I think this stems from some of those criticisms we spoke about earlier, but there's a real question of how to structure governance when it comes to enabling research. And we spoke, briefly earlier about these sort of key needs or points of centralization or accountability among users, but I'd be curious to dig into that a little bit further and just ask how you would approach the problem of weighting governance.
Weighting governance in general, so at a high level, looking at how I would weight, how I would enable or how a structure might enable different stakeholders to have different levels of say in an organization.
Yeah, and specific points within that you would say matter the most when we're dealing with research and when we're dealing with DeSci in general.
Yeah, I think it's, one of the current problems that I think exist largely in the DAO space at the moment is that this kind of one token, one vote structure misses the mark on a lot of levels. And there's people that try to solve that problem with a bunch of different approaches, whether it's things like delegated voting, whether it's having trusted members of the community that are kind of signaling, in some capacity. But I think it stems from this problem of the fundraising for projects largely being coupled directly to governance. And you kind of have, this is a kind of an incentive dilemma in some ways. What I think, democracy is not perfect, but it's probably the best system that we have. I think this is there's levels to that, and there's some truth, and I think there's also some things that aren't truth. The way that I would encourage, the way that I talk to DAOs today that are trying to design their incentive frameworks and trying to design their governance, trying to figure out how things would look like, is this idea that common sense plays, I think, a larger part in the process than one would expect. The people who are domain experts that have deep scientific expertise, that have years of experience, should probably have more leverage and more say when it comes to evaluating the quality of scientific data than someone that does not. There are, and this gets really complex at a certain scale because start trying to use a relative system to weight very, very subjective things that are not empirically measurable. But the big takeaway for me with governance is that you want a flexible, iterative framework that incorporates learnings and data on a kind of day-to-day basis and that measures outcomes and basically refines based on the success that you're having with specific outcomes. So if you're able to, for example, you should be focused in any organization on empowering the people that are intrinsically motivated, on empowering the people with autonomy and the ability to even act independently, that have a strong sense of initiative and want to run with that are super aligned with your vision and your mission. If you're someone building a DAO, if you're trying to accomplish a particular piece of research. And within that, I think you want to, also be quite literally like A/B test and trying to figure out what enables a certain level or what unlocks a certain level of progress. So, the structures that we currently look at in bio-DAOs that really kind of through this process of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 governance, going from informal conversation in Discord to larger conversation with community in Discord to token-based vote, even though the token holder in the end has this kind of binary yes or no vote and is the final say in essence, by the time that vote is being made, there's been a huge amount of context developed and conversation by a community of experts that the token holder themselves, by reading a proposal, is kind of informed enough to be able to make a decision. And this sort of nuance, realizing that you need to engineer a process before there's this very binary token-based vote that improves outcomes, is the kind of, for me, the main consideration with governance. And it's also realizing that you want to be able to empower individuals, you want to empower stewards, you want to empower those people that are going to make a huge impact on your DAO and not have this very slow, laborious process for moving a proposal along. And this is the delicate balance with governance. It's enabling people to work efficiently and quickly and feel empowered and actually get stuff done and operate, while still enabling the broader community at large to have impact and input on everything that's happening. And that balance can easily tip in the wrong direction on either side.
Gotcha. To put a bow on this quickly, how do you think about determining success and measuring outcomes of all of this? You seem to point earlier, you point out this need for greater internal accountability and structuring things in the way you might at a startup. But what do you point to as a barometer here? Like, is it citations? Is it dollars allocated? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's the very long term and then there's the near term. Long term, it's like, it's things like the number of therapeutics that are coming to market or to the clinic. It's the efficacy of those therapeutics versus the kind of market standard. It's the accessibility of them, how they're priced, how they're accessed. It's the extent to which we are, the kind of most reduced way to look at that would be like the lowest amount of dollars spent per quality achieved, right? Like this would be the ultimate, right? We want to bring down the cost of increasing the number of quality years of life, period. And then in the near term, there's, unfortunately, because drug development is such a long tail process, it's more, it's much more near term goals. So it's like time to proceed to like next stage. It's, the dollar average cost of research output. It's a bunch of things around looking at how you have this incredibly inefficient process at the moment and trying to think about very functionally, if the DAOs, if the structures that we have, if the capital allocation structures, if the incubation structures that we have are actually functionally improving that. And then there's another entire layer beyond that, which is just very realistically, we're trying to deal with like a multi-trillion-dollar problem when we're talking about drug development, and we're literally at like the kind of child's play part of that equation. Like the entire ecosystem probably has less than $30 million in it, something like this. It's super nascent. And so we have to set our sights a little bit more on these very, very near-term goals. It's like the belief that having a community that's funding a very early stage project for a relatively small amount of money, being able to show that they can allocate that funding in a way that produces a better outcome cheaper than the status quo, but on very short timelines.
Got it. All right, so let's take like a few steps back now. I think we've done a pretty good job of talking about what works, what doesn't, and what needs changing. But as we start to close things out here, why don't we cover the bull and bear case more broadly here? So having spoken about measuring outcomes, in your opinion now, and of course as someone who's unabashedly bullish, what would you say is the bull case and the bear case for DeSci more broadly?
Yeah, the bull case is in, a couple of years from now, we've completely decoupled largely from institutions, or there's a new form of institution that is, DAOs. There's people sitting at a computer somewhere in India collaborating with, a Harvard graduate, for example, and a group of scientists all over the world with a few funders doing like decentralized drug development from a couple of bedrooms, working with robotic CROs. I mean, really this fundamental disintermediation into a way that is fully collaborative, is leveraging things like AI and ML in a meaningful way to actually really, really reduce the cost of drug development in a decentralized way and with an incentive structure that really speaks to the best type of societal outcomes. For DeSci, I think it goes to what I said a moment ago about anyone can participate in science that has something to add. Knowledge is something that the barrier to creation around it, the barrier of creation to discovery is much, much lower. And the kind of all of the kind of core problems that you see in the sciences are slowly being iterated on and improved on through the basis of, having gutted out the kind of entrenched problem space that is currently plaguing a lot of it. The bear case, I think, is that we just completely recapitulate the same system that exists right now on chain. That would be like the idea that you would have, there's a lot of LARPing. We spend too much time in our own echo chamber, talking to each other and congratulating each other for the projects that we're building, and not spending enough time talking to scientists and to researchers and to integrating learnings and to shipping and to trying things and to proving concept. It takes us too long to gain meaningful traction. Investor interest dries up. These are the kind of, I think, near-term risks my biggest fear would be that, I think my biggest fear is that we succeed at some of the things that we're talking about, but the powers that be and the interests that exist in the current system manage to just integrate in a way that makes the outcome kind of null. You know what I mean? Like, for example, if Molecule at scale just became a feeder pipeline to pharmaceutical companies without changing the way they behave, or if, Research Hub, or if any of these projects, Vita DAO, for example, or anything ended up producing longevity therapeutics that were only available to very rich people. These are, I think, the risks, but I genuinely believe it'll be a bit of both. Like, I think you'll see projects that fizzle out. I think you'll see some projects that have impact. And the thing that I kind of like from a legacy perspective, even though we're super early, the thing that I am super grateful for every day is that there are now, compared to 3 years ago, a bunch of incredibly intelligent people, smarter than me, thinking about this problem and trying to build things that 100% are going to change the future. And if Molecule died off tomorrow, for example, there would be a generation of builders who would carry on creating something that I think will absolutely, without a doubt, have a positive effect on the system.
I love it. So for anyone interested, and as a bit of a call to action here, why should people care, and where can they get involved if they're interested?
I think you should care if you've ever been sick, if you've ever known anyone that has been sick, if you care about human knowledge and its progression. Like, if you understand the impact that science has and want to do something to improve it, there's probably a way for you to do so right now in this ecosystem. You can reach out to me personally at Tyler at molecule.to. You can find me on Discord, on Molecule server, join the server. If you're building a DAO, we have an incubator program called BioXYZ, and we would love to give you a grant and help you, go to market. And if you ever just want to connect around why this ecosystem is important, I'm always available and would love to chat. And then go check out all the other amazing projects that are being built in the DeSci space. Molecule and the kind of ecosystem it's creating is like 1/10, and maybe even much smaller than that by this stage of the kind of like incredible projects that are being shipped in virtually every vertical of the sciences. Really excited to see how the space develops.
Me too. All right, Tyler, thanks for doing this, man. This has been great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alex. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. For more information about this podcast and Molecule, and if you have any questions and want to get into a deeper discussion about today's topics, feel free to visit Molecule's site, Twitter, or Discord. You can find all the important links in the description and show notes below. Also, if you're a researcher seeking funding, if you want to start working in a biotech DAO or get involved in any way, please visit Molecule's website at molecule.to for more information. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you again soon.